There is a fawn lying in the grass. It has been lying there for approximately 6 hours. It has not moved. It is not injured. Its limbs are fine. Its breathing is normal. It is alert in the specific way that prey animals are alert when they are staying very still and hoping nothing notices them. It is simply lying there, alone, in a meadow, without its mother anywhere visible. And if you were an ancient human encountering this specific scenario for the first time, your interpretation of it would almost certainly be wrong. You would think, this fawn has been abandoned. Something happened to the mother. This animal needs help. The reality, the mother is somewhere in the tree line approximately 100 meters away, watching you with an intensity that you cannot currently perceive, waiting for you to stop standing next to her fawn so that she can come back. She has placed the fawn here deliberately. She returns to feed it several times per day. She has not abandoned it, she has parked it in the specific way that deer park fawns during the period when their most effective survival strategy is to be completely stationary and odorless, while the mother forages at a distance that keeps predators from connecting the fawn's location to her movement patterns. The fawn is not abandoned. The fawn is on its own, which is completely different. This misunderstanding, the specifically human tendency to interpret animal offspring alone as animal offspring abandoned, is the starting point for one of the most important and most counterintuitive stories in all of behavioral ecology. Because animal mothers do sometimes abandon their offspring, and when they do, it is neither an accident, nor a failure, nor an expression of inadequate maternal love. It is a decision, in the biological sense of a behavioral outcome produced by evolved decision systems, that reflects a specific kind of cold evolutionary logic that is completely alien to human moral intuitions and simultaneously completely coherent from an evolutionary perspective. Understanding when and why animal mothers abandon offspring tells you something profound about the economics of reproduction, about the evolutionary architecture of maternal behavior, and about the specific ways that ancient humans observed and understood the animal world they were embedded in. Start with the foundational concept, because without it, everything else is uninterpretable. Maternal behavior in animals is not primarily an expression of love. It is an evolved strategy for maximizing reproductive success across a lifetime. This framing is not cynical, it is biological. The neurochemical systems that produce the specific emotional experiences associated with maternal attachment are themselves adaptations that evolved because they produced behavioral outcomes that maximized lifetime reproductive success in the ancestral environment. Love and evolutionary optimization are not opposites in this context. The love is the mechanism through which the optimization is implemented. The important implication of this framework, maternal behavior is not unconditionally maximized investment in any specific offspring. Maternal behavior is investment in offspring calibrated to the specific conditions that determine the expected reproductive return on that investment. When conditions are such that investment in a specific offspring is likely to produce a viable offspring that survives to reproduce, strong maternal investment is the optimal strategy. When conditions are such that investment in a specific offspring would likely fail, or would succeed only at a cost that compromises the mother's future reproductive capacity so severely that her lifetime reproductive success is reduced or terminated investment can be the optimal strategy. This is the evolutionary logic of offspring abandonment. It is the behavioral outcome when the specific cost-benefit calculation of maternal investment in a particular offspring under specific current conditions produces a negative expected value for the mother's lifetime reproductive success. The calculation is not conscious. Mothers are not sitting down with spreadsheets. The calculation is implemented through evolved behavioral systems that respond to specific cues in specific ways that, across the ancestral environment in which those systems evolved, produced the behavioral outcomes that maximized lifetime reproductive success. The cue response. Systems that implement abandonment decisions in different species are specific, varied, and in many cases extraordinarily sophisticated. In birds, the most extensively studied case of offspring abandonment involves the specific cues that parent birds use to assess offspring quality and survival probability. Hatching order in many species determines which chicks receive preferential parental investment. First hatched chicks are typically larger and more vigorous, while last hatched chicks may be substantially smaller and less competitive for parental food delivery. In resource-limited years, the last hatched chick is frequently the one that receives reduced investment and may be allowed to die. Not by active action, but by preferential feeding of the more viable siblings. The specific cue that drives this differential investment is the vigor of the begging signal. Chicks signal their hunger and vitality through specific vocalizations and posturing during feeding visits. More vigorous chicks produce stronger begging signals. Parent birds allocate food preferentially to the strongest begging signal, which is both the most vigorous chick and the chick producing the most reliable signal of its own quality and survival probability. The system is self-calibrating. Investment follows the strongest signal, which tracks the most viable offspring. In mammalian species, the cues are different, but the underlying logic is the same. In many ungulate species, deer, zebras, wildebeest, mothers assess offspring quality and vigor immediately after birth through specific behavioral tests. A healthy, viable foal or calf rises and attempts to nurse within minutes of birth. The mother's response to this attempt, whether she permits nursing or moves away, is the behavioral expression of a quality assessment. Foals or calves that fail to rise promptly, fail to nurse effectively, or fail to produce the specific vocalizations and behaviors that trigger maternal bonding may not elicit the full maternal investment sequence. The timing of this assessment is specific and significant. The window in which maternal bonding is established, the period immediately after birth when the mother is most receptive to forming the specific attachment to her offspring, is also the period in which the offspring quality assessment is most efficiently conducted. Missing the bonding window has consequences that are not easily reversed, because the neurochemical state that supports strong maternal investment is most easily established in the immediate postpartum period. Resource availability is the most powerful single predictor of abandonment decisions across mammalian species, and it provides a direct connection to the ancient human context. In species that have been studied across varying resource conditions, the rate of offspring abandonment increases in predictable ways as resource availability decreases. When food is abundant, mothers are willing to invest in offspring of lower than optimal quality because the cost of investment is lower relative to available resources. When food is scarce, the threshold for adequate offspring quality rises. Mothers will only invest in offspring whose quality is high enough to justify the increased relative cost of investment under limited resource conditions. This is not cruelty. This is the specific evolutionary logic of a system that evolved under conditions of resource variability. A mother that continues heavy investment in a low-quality offspring during a resource scarcity event may not survive that event in adequate condition to reproduce again. A mother that calibrates her investment downward in response to low-quality offspring during resource scarcity may survive to produce multiple high-quality offspring in subsequent seasons. The lifetime reproductive success calculation favors the second strategy. In some mammalian species, this resource-conditioned assessment extends to litter size management. Pigs and canids that produce large litters in poor resource years will sometimes not support all offspring through to weaning. The available milk supply is insufficient for the litter size, and the offspring that are most vigorous at accessing the nursing positions will grow at the expense of those that are less vigorous. The mother is not making a specific choice about which offspring to sacrifice. She is providing the resource, and the offspring are determining by competition which ones have sufficient vigor to access it. The outcome is the same as deliberate selection. The mechanism is distributed competition rather than maternal choice. The ancient human encounter with offspring abandonment across the species of their landscape was a continuous feature of ancient ecological observation, and understanding that encounter requires appreciating both what ancient humans saw and what they made of it. Ancient humans who were systematically observing the animal communities of their territories, as every successful hunter-gatherer community did, were witnessing offspring abandonment events with enough regularity that these events were incorporated into the accumulated ecological knowledge of their communities. Not as moral assessments of animal behavior, but as practical ecological information with specific implications for hunting strategy, for understanding prey population dynamics, and for the specific encounters with abandoned or apparently abandoned young animals that ancient humans regularly faced. The specifically human response to the apparent abandonment of animal offspring, the infant care impulse triggered by the stimulus features of young animals, the specific behavioral response of approaching and potentially intervening, was producing real-world encounters with a wide range of abandoned and non-abandoned young animals that ancient humans had to navigate with whatever combination of ecological knowledge and immediate assessment they could bring to bear. An ancient hunter who understood that deer fawns found alone were not necessarily abandoned, who knew that the doe was likely nearby and would return, had ecological knowledge that was directly applicable to practical decisions. Disturbing a fawn when the doe was nearby was a different ecological situation from abandoned orphan, with different implications for the doe's behavior and the hunter's safety. The ecological knowledge of abandonment versus temporary separation was survival-relevant knowledge for ancient humans encountering young animals in the landscape. Explore the specific cases where genuine abandonment occurs in species that ancient humans regularly encountered, because the distinction between apparent and genuine abandonment was practically important, and the cases of genuine abandonment reveal important things about the evolutionary systems involved. In colonial nesting birds, gulls, terns, gannets, the specific social dynamics of colonial nesting create conditions in which chicks that wander from their nest site may be attacked by neighboring adults and may then be abandoned by their own parents if those parents cannot locate them and distinguish them from the neighboring chicks. The parent's identification of its own chick depends on the chick being in the expected location, the nest site where the recognition process was established, and when that locational cue is absent, the recognition system fails. This is not a failure of parental love. It is a failure of the specific recognition mechanism, the nest site-dependent recognition system that evolved because, in the ancestral colonial nesting context, chicks in the nest were your chicks and chicks outside the nest were not. The abandonment in this case is a product of the limitation of the recognition system encountering an unusual situation. In some primate species, including the baboons whose social dynamics ancient humans in African environments regularly observed, first-time mothers occasionally show inadequate maternal behavior toward their first offspring. Failing to position the infant correctly for nursing, not responding appropriately to the infant's distress signals, in some cases failing to maintain the infant with sufficient attention to prevent its death. These failures of maternal competence are more common in first-time mothers and decline with experience, and in some cases other females in the group compensate for inadequate maternal behavior by providing allomothering, caring for the infant in the primary mother's absence or in addition to her care. The baboon case was almost certainly observed and incorporated into ancient human ecological knowledge in African environments. Ancient humans who had observed baboon social groups over extended periods, as some specialized hunters certainly had, would have seen both the failures of first-time mothers and the compensatory allomothering of experienced females, and would have built these patterns into their understanding of the animal social world they inhabited. Address the question of infanticide as distinct from abandonment, because the two are often conflated, and the distinction is important for understanding the full range of maternal investment decisions in animal species. Active infanticide, the killing of offspring by parents, typically but not exclusively by males, is documented across a wide range of species and is governed by different evolutionary logic than abandonment. The most extensively studied case is male infanticide, in lions, langur monkeys, and various other species in which a new dominant male kills the existing offspring of females in the group. The evolutionary logic is the takeover of the female's reproductive investment. The death of the existing offspring triggers the female's return to reproductive cycling, allowing the new male to father offspring. Maternal infanticide is less common but documented in specific contexts. In rats and mice, maternal cannibalism of offspring is documented at elevated rates in conditions of severe resource stress or overcrowding. The specific trigger appears to be a threshold effect in which the cost of sustaining any offspring exceeds a critical limit, producing the behavioral outcome of terminating current reproductive investment entirely to preserve the mother's survival and future reproductive capacity. In domestic animals, a context where ancient humans in the later phases of domestication would have observed the behavior, maternal infanticide was occasionally observed and was presumably integrated into the ancient human understanding of animal maternal behavior. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The ancient human who had observed a sow killing a runt of her litter had observed an extreme version of the differential investment logic that produced litter size management under resource scarcity. These observations were not comfortable, and there is no reason to assume ancient humans were emotionally neutral about them. Ancient humans had well-developed emotional responses to infant vulnerability, strong infant care impulses triggered by specific features of young animals, and the specific moral intuitions that would have made maternal infanticide in observed animals emotionally significant. The ecological knowledge was acquired alongside emotional response, and the integration of uncomfortable ecological reality with emotional response was part of the ongoing cognitive work of being an intelligent observer of the natural world. The connection between animal maternal abandonment behavior and the ancient human understanding of their own reproductive decisions is a dimension of this topic that requires careful handling, but deserves direct examination. Ancient humans faced reproductive decisions, including decisions about which offspring received full maternal investment, under conditions that were sometimes as resource-constrained as the conditions that drive abandonment in other animal species. The human infant mortality rates of the ancient period were extraordinary by modern standards, and the decisions that ancient communities made about which infants received the full resources of the community's care were sometimes influenced by the specific logic that governs abandonment in other species: offspring quality, resource availability, and the mother's future reproductive capacity. The documentation of infanticide in ancient human populations, through archaeological evidence of infant remains without the burial treatment given to older individuals, through ethnographic accounts of infanticide in resource-stressed traditional communities, reflects the operation of similar evolutionary cost-benefit logic in the species that spent the most time observing that logic in the animal world. This is not to reduce ancient human reproductive decisions to simple animal behavior. Human reproductive decisions were embedded in cultural frameworks, social obligations, and moral systems that created contexts and constraints with no equivalent in the decisions of ungulate mothers or colonial nesting birds. The point is that the underlying evolutionary logic, the cost-benefit calculation of maternal investment under resource constraint, was operating in the human case as a background pressure on reproductive behavior, even as cultural and moral frameworks shaped the specific forms that behavior took. Ancient humans observing abandonment behavior in the animals of their landscape were not observing something entirely foreign to their own experience. They were observing a behavior that reflected the same evolutionary pressures that influenced, in different and culturally mediated forms, their own reproductive decisions. The ecological knowledge and the self-knowledge were not as separate as modern framing of these topics might suggest. Here is the full picture that assembles from everything examined. The fawn in the meadow is not abandoned. The doe is in the tree line, watching, waiting for you to leave, operating a maternal strategy that evolved because it was more effective than continuous close accompaniment during the period when the fawn's best survival strategy is invisibility and odorlessness. The strategy works. The species is not endangered. The cases of genuine abandonment, when they occur in birds, in ungulates, in primates, across the full range of species that show the behavior, are the behavioral outputs of evolved decision systems responding to specific environmental and offspring quality cues in ways that, under the conditions that shaped their evolution, produced the lifetime reproductive success outcomes that maximized population fitness. They are not failures of maternal love. They are expressions of a biological logic that is indifferent to moral intuitions. Ancient humans observing this behavior across the animal communities of their territories were building accurate, nuanced, ecologically sophisticated models of a behavioral phenomenon that was neither simple nor morally uncomplicated. They were integrating the discomfort of observing behaviors that their own emotional systems evaluated negatively with the practical ecological knowledge that accurate understanding of those behaviors provided. The specific ancient human encounter with the abandoned animal, the orphaned young animal that did require intervention because its mother was absent, was the specific encounter that began the domestication trajectories of multiple species. The infant care impulse activated by the stimulus features of young animals, combined with the ecological knowledge to distinguish genuinely abandoned from temporarily alone, produced the specific ancient human behavioral response: pick up, nurture, maintain. That started the processes whose products share our homes and farms today. The evolutionary logic that produces abandonment in other species was, in the ancient human case, being countered by a different evolutionary logic. The extraordinary investment in offspring that makes the human reproductive strategy so demanding, so costly, and so productive, of the specific kind of cognitively sophisticated, long-dependent offspring that the human lineage specializes in. Ancient humans looked at a fawn lying in the grass. They assessed the situation. Some of them walked away, some of them picked it up. The ones who picked it up were running the same basic reproductive logic as the ones who walked away, maximizing the expected return on investment, just with a different cost-benefit calculation operating over different time horizons and through different evolutionary systems. The fawn's mother, still watching from the tree line, would eventually come back. She always comes back until the calculation says she should not.